So, hello, I'm Dom Harvey. I'm one of the experts by experience, and that's a pretty new role within the council. So, a bit of a description of what we do to bring people up to speed is that we are young people aged sort of 20 to 26 um, with SEND that grew up in Hearts. And so I'm one of four, and we sort of form part of a much larger network of young people with SEND at sort of various levels in school and so on. And basically, we use our lived experience to help develop co-production in the council, and we do that in a number of ways. Some of your more sort of classic advise and guide, um, and then we also give talks like this. Um, and if all goes to plan, hopefully we will be developing some new things later. Um, and then usually we do stuff that's kind of more specific to our interests as individuals. So, for example, one of our experts, CJ, he cares a lot about EHCPs, so does a lot of work with that, and so that kind of thing. So that's part of helping foster co-production is that it's not just having us there; it's sort of letting us having a direct impact on what's important to us. But hopefully that gives some insight into the role, um, and that for us, this isn't necessarily a job or a service, and it's not just advocating for ourselves, it's advocating for a great many other people too. So you want that job to be both impactful and important. But moving on, uh, we're going to get involved in a little exercise that may have involved some of you in advance. As this is for a festival of good practice, obviously the focus will be on that and how to apply it. So I'm not entirely sure of the calendar for this week, but I imagine you've all got a nauseating number of workshops and seminars and the like. So to get you started, I had Sarah and some others collect your top three examples of bad practice in Send so that we could see where the good practice is needed. And as you might be able to tell, I've organized the responses into themes, and then their sort of size in the word cloud indicates how frequently they came up. And so obviously the largest issue there is poor communication, which is obviously a huge issue in everyone's professional and personal lives. So no surprise there, really. But what was interesting about this was that the number referring to communication um, with parents, with their co-workers, with other services, and with schools and so on, all came up roughly equally. So to me, that suggests something systemic and about the methods used rather than the choices being made by individuals. Uh, Another one I want to draw your attention to is not family and child focused or child focused. Um, I think this alludes to a more pervasive problem found across lots of professions. How do you make something that is regimented enough to be applied fairly, but sort of personalized enough to have a sort of meaningful positive impact? But that being said, the acronym POSIWID springs to mind. The point of a system is what it does. Um, this sort of argues that the rhetoric and ideology going into a system doesn't really count for anything if that system then does something entirely different or doesn't work. If it's not servicing the service user, then obviously something has to change. And then the last one I wanted to talk about specifically was difficulty coordinating, uh, a more sort of figuratively and literally large problem. We, as the experts, have only had a small taste of the number of teams and organizations and services and so on, but it's clear we're all working within quite a large beast. So, I think it would be naive to say that we can upend all of that, but if we can't make the system more agile, then it needs to at least be easier to navigate for users and providers. And then obviously there are some more points up there that maybe dwarf, but we're still in people's top three that would be good to get into, but it's still very interesting, but to what end? Okay, so it's examples we gathered from you, so obviously you are aware of them. It's not to catch anyone out or shame them, again, because they're up here, people know they're bad. And also, I have a feeling it's a little above probably most of our pay grades. Take the biggest issue, for example, poor communication in large organizations, both internally and externally. That's a huge problem faced across all sectors at all levels. and is the sort of subject of intense study and scrutiny from far greater minds than ours. So no, we did all of this for comparison's sake, because we have a second word cloud to show you. One that we gather from our friends and our family and other SEND individuals with direct personal lived experience for them to tell us what they think is bad practice. Now, the scientist in me must caveat that, first of all, this was not sort of empirically sampled and rigorously controlled. This was very informal. Some of the professionals maybe send themselves. Some of these sort of lived experience responses, maybe from different counties or regions when we're sort of focused in hearts. But this is a thought-provoking exercise above all else. And looking at lived experience cloud, we can see some interesting similarities, but also differences. The first one I want to draw your attention to is poor application of knowledge. I almost grouped this one into poor knowledge of SEND, but it came up enough that I thought it warranted different, sort of different theme. And it touched on several ideas. We all know, or at least hope, that the professionals that SEND individuals deal with are literally qualified to and have knowledge of various disabilities and needs, from training, qualifications, so on. And yet, it isn't always fully applied. That concepts can sort of be cerebrally understood and known, but that they're rarely utilized to their fullest, if at all. You can have a quiet sensory room implemented somewhere, but the rest of a building's more practical functions will be blanketed in harsh lighting and constant chatter. That the alternative working styles found with SEND individuals aren't just sort of encouraged, but are quite so often championed as inclusion. But then the less desirable needs, such as extra time off to recover from burnout, are swept aside as complaints of idle laziness. Over pathologizing SEND behavior means that sort of novel or unsuccessful attempts at communication will be belittled or outright ignored, even though the same rationale drives and often leads to similar behavior in non-SEND individuals. I could go on with more and more examples of the list as long as my arm, but hopefully my point is clear that it's a common saying that theory only gets you so far. In the profession of people, SEND or otherwise, it's no different. And perhaps actually might be more relevant than anywhere else. A slightly smaller one there, though, moving on, that I still find interesting is intersectionality. And I find it interesting because it doesn't directly apply to me as much as it does to other SEND individuals and families, and yet still I find it damning. Because if you humor an anecdote, in the early 2000s, I was described by a child psych as having minor anxiety and only mimicking my older autistic sister's behavior. Fast forward, and discovered purely by chance, after the fact when digging through paperwork, I find out the doctor who suggested I get an autism diagnosis in 2018 was that same child psych from all those years ago. Now, kudos to them. They were dead on the mark with minor anxiety, but my point is that we have the same person, we have the remarkable instance of the same person being assessed by the same clinician and them getting a different result. Now, I tell you this because the diagnostic history of autism is one of very narrow sampling. It is overwhelmingly straight white males, often of a very young age, and with sort of classic systemic interests. So much so that psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen described autism as the, quote, extreme male brain as late as 2002. Now, so by all metrics, I am a cookie cutter rubber stamp autistic. You can see I'm a white man. I'm comfortable sharing that I'm heterosexual and cisgender. And from a young age, I've sort of loved all things maths, science, and dorky, and I now do mechanical engineering. So, I mean, the DSM-5 should have a picture of me under the entry for autism, and yet I flew entirely under the radar of NHS and CYP professionals until about 6 or so years ago. If I was failed, then who is still? We're beginning to see a massive two-way overlap with neurodivergence and queer identities for one, and sticking with autism, as various groups have gained better access and understanding, we're beginning to see that commonly cited 1% rate of occurrence is beginning to seem like a very, very low ball. And yet, still to this day, very narrow frameworks are applied en masse, missing any number of behaviors that have particular correlation and causation with race, gender, and other identities. My mind is naturally drawn to the graph of left-handedness over time. It spiked massively after we stopped forcing everyone to be right-handed, entirely because they were there all along. So what benefits would we gain from assessing the roots of our framework and thinking? The last one I want to talk about is under-delivering. One of the other experts, Katie, raised some very good points about this, particularly with regards to accessibility of the service, which also is something that appeared in the professionals word cloud. She gives a good insight as the most recently diagnosed out of all of us, so she's best positioned to speak on both the current state of services available and how easily they're navigated. Her experience is one of being drained by the sustained energy needed to get support, that without the time advantage of an early years diagnosis. There is a great deal to figure out on your own and with little to no help, labouring under a convoluted system of providing evidence, that evidence being rejected, which is kind of weird in its own right, but then a decision being reversed and support being provided only for it to be outdated or illegible or overwhelming or requiring more paperwork. It leaves you feeling that it's simply not worth pursuing, that nothing at all is at least clearer than a million phone calls and forms and rejections and meetings and so on. Now, as with the other word cloud, there is more to be unpicked here as well. But as much as I'd love to, for timekeeping's sake, after a brief examination of the two, you can see there are some common or similar ones, but that by and large, the two word clouds are very different in both distribution and specifics. The professionals word cloud was almost entirely dominated by poor communication, to the point where when I was making it, I actually had to modify the scale so that the rest of it would be readable. Whereas in the lived experience, you can see a lot of equal or similar weighting across a variety of issues. Again, to the scientist in me, part of that's just sort of interesting rather than damning. But as for specifics, it's clear some of the lived experience entries are consequences of poor communication, bad documentation, EHCPs not being followed, slowness, and so on. But we also received a litany of responses about other issues. Issues that are so fundamental to all of our experience with professionals and wider SEND services, and that yet didn't appear in the professionals word cloud as frequently, if at all. Now, the why is the more complicated part. We limited people to 3 entries for ease and focus. Perhaps there would be more crossover if we asked for more. Maybe the poor communication is such a bottleneck that it's sort of a hindrance for anything else to arise. I'm drifting into the territory of much finer nuance for someone who doesn't walk your halls every day and who, is from an entirely different walk of life, both professionally and personally. But what we think it does show is our entire purpose. On the face of it, the thoughts and feelings of SEND people are worlds apart from the biggest problems facing the way services made for them operate. That people with lived experience aren't just here to augment and refine what you do, but that our input is absolutely critical to the base function of these services. And so I sort of think of an excerpt from a larger quote by the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, which says this: "In the matter of boots, I defer to the authority of the bootmaker." That is to say, in all walks of life, we should, and often do implicitly and subconsciously, rely entirely on the knowledge of experts to go about our day-to-day lives. For a time, services like this, rely, and the wider understanding of neurodiversity and disability relied on academic expertise, which I think is more than normal and to be expected. But as I alluded to earlier, academia has only disturbingly recently started addressing the errors and sometimes malicious biases in its body of knowledge, from historic inaccuracy all the way to just plain erasure. And so until those are rooted out, or maybe to root them out, perhaps best to gain understanding from a different expert. Dare I say, an expert by experience. Now, I will admit that this was a pretty down, depressing exercise. It didn't put things in an amazing light, and it seems like we experts sort of lured you here for a surprise cross-examination, and then handed you a very bitter pill. So apologies in that regard. But the School of Hard Knocks can be as valuable as any other. And above all else, you're all here. You are in these services and not some corporate call center or some luxurious skyrise. You have made the conscious decision to help your local community. And in my humble opinion, that puts you on a better footing to make positive change than I think anything else ever could. And our hope is that you take what you've seen here today, what we've told you, and what we will tell you as we work with you, and you kind of have it as a little sort of kernel of focus in the back of your mind, that you go into the rest of this week and, you know, as you learn all these new good practices, you don't just have a how to improve, but also the where to apply it. And so finally, I would like to thank you for all of you for listening to my delivery of our thoughts as the experts. I hope you enjoyed what we had to say, and above all else, we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.